I stood by the window of our bedroom, watching as the evening lights of San Diego slowly filled the streets. My new home with its tall glass walls seemed like a fortress. But it lacked warmth. It felt like with each of Tom's business trips, our conversations grew shorter. And an invisible wall grew between us. He often left for work before dawn and returned late at night, bringing only the remnants of fatigue and the smell of office coffee. We spoke less and less. And I felt our world, once full of joy, was sliding into an abyss of emptiness. The house felt alive, but simultaneously cold. Like a museum. In its corners, our memories reflected. But I couldn't remember the last time I laughed with Tom. I knew he loved me. But his love had turned into a habit. Something like a duty that loses its meaning when you perform it daily without thinking. The promises we made to each other on the ocean shore the day we became husband and wife started to feel distant and unreal. As if they belonged to someone else. Alex, Tom's son from his first marriage, was my only companion in this emptiness. We sat in the kitchen preparing dinner. And I listened to his stories about friends, work, and the future. Alex was only a few years younger than me. And though this initially created some discomfort, we soon became almost like brother and sister. He often invited his friends over, trying to bring life back to our quiet home. One evening, he suggested I join them and his best friend, Oliver. I did not expect that this dinner would change everything. Oliver burst into my life unexpectedly. Tall with bright eyes and a charming smile. He was the complete opposite of Tom. It seemed he radiated energy that had disappeared from my world lately. Sitting at the table, I listened to his stories about his work as an architect. About new projects that seemed too ambitious for his age. But his voice had a confidence that captivated me. He spoke with such passion. As if every one of his ideas could change the world. And I realized I hadn't felt anything like that for a long time. That evening, when Tom was once again late at work, Alex, Oliver, and I prepared dinner on the terrace, laughing and discussing everything under the sun. From future plans to the day's little details. At some point, I noticed how Oliver was looking at me. It wasn't just a glance. There was something more in it than mere friendly curiosity. I tried to ignore it. But the warmth of his attention gradually crept inside, making my heart beat faster. At night, lying in an empty bed, I couldn't sleep. Scenes from the evening played in my mind. Especially the moments when Oliver joked. And as I laughed, I felt something inside me finally come alive. It was a strange feeling. A mix of anxiety and joy. As if I were doing something wrong yet finding solace in it. The next few days, I tried not to think about what was happening. I convinced myself it was just a fleeting crush. A mere distraction from the dull routine and loneliness surrounding me. But every time our eyes met, I felt something new. As if the world had become slightly brighter. Slightly sharper. I didn't know where this would lead. But it seemed to me that I was on the verge of something unknown and dangerous. And although my mind screamed to stop, my heart could no longer go back. Saturday began as usual. Tom, as always, left early, leaving a brief note on the kitchen table. Work. I'll be late. I stood with a cup of coffee, looking at the short message, and tried to understand when all this had become the norm. Our conversations had turned into an exchange of short phrases. As if we were neighbors. Not spouses. I felt the emptiness filling every corner of the house. And this feeling followed me even outside its walls. Alex suggested spending the day together. And I reluctantly agreed. We met with his friends at the beach. Including Oliver. He seemed even more charming in the sunlight. Laughing. telling stories about his latest projects. I tried to be just an observer, enjoying the company. But every time he looked my way, I felt my heart race. I knew I shouldn't. But something inside me didn't want to resist. After the beach, Alex suggested having dinner at his place. And we agreed. While Alex cooked, Oliver and I sat on the terrace watching the sunset. We talked about trivial things. But every look, every gesture of his seemed so significant. He spoke about his dreams of building his dream house, his ambitions. And there was such passion in his words that I realized I lacked this in my life. When the sun set and the sky turned soft shades of purple and pink, Alex stepped out for a moment, leaving us alone. A sudden silence hung between us. But it wasn't frightening. It was enveloping like a warm blanket. Oliver looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in my reflection for a long time. A lively interest and desire. I tried to ignore these feelings. But his presence was too strong to ignore. Have you ever wanted to change something in your life? He suddenly asked. And I froze, not knowing what to answer. His question was simple, but hit the mark. As if he were reading my thoughts. Sometimes I feel stuck, I confessed, realizing I was saying more than I should. In this house. In this life. And I don't even know how to get out. He came closer, his hand briefly touching mine. And that simple touch made me forget everything. I felt a blush spreading across my cheeks. And before I could think, Oliver leaned in. The kiss was unexpected. Short. But so intense that it made my head spin. It was a moment when everything around froze. I should have pushed him away. Said it was wrong. But my lips responded to his touch. When we pulled away, I saw the same confusion in his eyes that I felt myself. He straightened, as if realizing what had happened. And his face flashed a mix of emotions. I wanted to say something. Try to explain to myself and to him that it was a mistake. But the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was look away and pretend nothing had happened. Alex returned, not noticing the tension between us. And we continued the evening as if nothing had happened. But I could no longer pretend. The kiss with Oliver had left a mark on me that I could not erase. That night, lying in bed, I replayed that moment over and over, trying to understand what was happening to me. I knew it was a path to nowhere. But inside me, I felt that I could no longer return to my previous life. The day began with a gray sky. As if the very universe sensed something was wrong. Tom left for another business trip, leaving only a cold voice on the answering machine. Don't wait up. I'll be late. I felt lost in our big house, which in his absence became even larger and colder. I wandered through the rooms doing household chores. But the thought of the kiss with Oliver gave me no peace. That moment, brief and silent, became something forbidden but equally alluring to me. Alex suggested I distract myself and invited me to dinner so I wouldn't be alone. He and Oliver came, laughing and joking as if nothing had happened. I watched Oliver from a distance, feeling a strange excitement that ordinary conversation could not hide. We were sitting at the table when Alex suggested stepping out onto the terrace for fresh air. And I felt the tension rising. The terrace was a secluded place, fenced off by a high wall and greenery, creating a sense of an enclosed space. Alex went upstairs for drinks, and Oliver and I were left alone. He stood nearby, but his silence was too eloquent. We both knew we should have kept our distance from each other. But this invisible magnet was pulling us closer again. I felt a struggle inside me between common sense and uncontrollable desire. Oliver took a step forward and I couldn't resist. We shouldn't, I whispered. But my words were drowned in the silence as he leaned closer. This time, the kiss was not like the first. It was slower, deeper, and contained everything I had been missing. It wasn't just an impulse, but something more conscious. As if we had both decided to take this step, knowing there was no way back. His hands rested on my shoulders, and I felt a warmth that reached the tips of my fingers. My heart was pounding as if trying to break free. And I realized that this time it was much more serious than a fleeting infatuation. It was a moment where I felt alive, as if for a brief instant I had returned to my former free life, where there was no room for obligations or duties. I pulled away first. But this gesture meant nothing. We both remained silent, not knowing how to explain what had happened. Thoughts swirled in my head. How would this affect our lives? What would happen next? But instead of walking away, we stayed close, as if afraid to break the fragile thing that had arisen between us. Alex returned with the glasses and noticed nothing strange. We pretended everything was fine. But it was impossible. The end. I felt the world around me changing with every moment. And I knew that sooner or later, everything would be revealed. Oliver and I continued to sit next to each other, avoiding each other's gaze. But the tension hung in the air. And every breath was filled with that very forbidden spark. That night became a turning point. I realized that the line that shouldn't have been crossed had been broken. And that our lives would never be the same. Tom still didn't know anything. And I couldn't tell how he would react. But it no longer mattered. I realized that all the decisions had already been made and that the way back was closed. That night, alone in the dark bedroom, I thought about how tomorrow would become even more complicated. But I could no longer stop. Days flowed slowly like a viscous river. And I couldn't find my place. Tom was still busy with work. His trips had become longer and our conversations shorter. I tried to behave as usual, hiding the growing tension. But every morning, looking in the mirror, I saw a woman I no longer recognized. Oliver came less and less frequently. And our meetings became clandestine, as if we both feared that every look could betray us. Alex also started to suspect something. His usual ease disappeared, replaced by caution and unspoken words. One day while we were sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee, he suddenly asked, "You and Oliver, are you okay?" I felt my heart stop. His question sounded innocent, but his gaze was too piercing. I looked away, pretending I didn't understand the hint. But inside, a troubling feeling grew that the secret would no longer remain a secret. That day, I met Oliver in a small cafe on the other side of town. He was sitting by the window, gazing thoughtfully at the street. And his look was as lost as my thoughts. We didn't know how to behave with each other. Pretend it was just a mistake. Or admit that things had gone too far. I sat across from him and instead of the usual greeting, an awkward silence hung between us. "I don't know what to do next," Oliver said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. And it was filled with so much doubt that I felt something inside me tighten. We sat across from each other, both tangled in the web of our feelings and obligations, not knowing how to get out. Inside me, a mix of fear, guilt, and something else brewed. Something I was afraid to admit. That same evening, Alex invited all of us to a family dinner, as if he were trying to restore the lost sense of normalcy. I understood that for him, it was a way to steer us away from the truth, to hide the pain that began to appear between the lines of our conversations. We sat at the table, pretending everything was fine. Tom talked about work. Alex joked about little things. And I stared at my plate, not noticing time passing by. After dinner, Alex unexpectedly called me for a talk. He looked more serious than usual, and his eyes were filled with concern. "You're hiding something, Emily," he said. And I felt a wave of fear wash over me. "I don't want to believe it. But something is happening between you and Oliver. Isn't it?" I tried to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat. All my efforts seemed meaningless. And I realized I could no longer hide the truth. Alex and I stood in the kitchen, surrounded by silence that seemed like an impenetrable wall between us. He waited for an answer. And I didn't know what to say, because every lie only made the situation worse. "It just happened," I finally said, feeling bitterness rising inside me. Alex took a step back, his eyes filled with disappointment. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, but his silence spoke more than any words. At that moment, I realized that I had destroyed everything that was between us. He wasn't just angry. He was deeply hurt because he trusted me like no one else. That night became the final straw. Alex left without a word, and I was left alone in the empty house, which now seemed like a cage. I had lost them all. Tom, Alex, and even myself. And while I tried to find excuses for my actions, there was only emptiness inside. And the understanding that the way back was no longer there. The emptiness that used to hide in the corners of our house had now filled it completely. Alex left for a few days without saying where he was going. And Tom left for another business trip without even bothering to say goodbye. I was left alone in the walls that were no longer my refuge, but rather a reminder of everything I had destroyed. Oliver's call stopped, and the silence of his absence was louder than any reproach. I tried to return to a normal state. Forced myself to go outside, shop, do routine chores. But every time I was overwhelmed by the realization that I no longer knew who I was in a small park near the house. I sat on a bench watching the children playing on the playground in their laughter. I heard something distant as if from another life that I could no longer return to one evening as the sunset painted the sky in bright shades of red and orange. I received a message from Oliver. "We need to meet, it's important." I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing what to reply. But part of me understood that this meeting was inevitable. We agreed to meet at the cafe where our forbidden romance had once begun. When I entered, Oliver was already waiting for me by the window. He looked tired and concerned. And when I sat down across from him, we exchanged short glances filled with unspoken words. We both knew that our past could no longer be our present. That everything had changed, and would never be the same again. I wanted to talk about what happens next. He began, sifting through his thoughts as if searching for the right words. We both knew we were playing with fire. But I didn't think it would go this far. His voice was hoarse and every word was tinged with bitterness. I looked at him and couldn't find the strength to say anything in response. Words had become useless when faced with the truth. "Oliver. I'm sorry." I finally managed. But my apologies felt empty. We both knew that regrets would not change what had already happened. Our gazes met. And I saw in his eyes the same emptiness I felt myself. The emptiness of loss that could no longer be filled. He placed his hand on the table, as if wanting to touch mine, but stopped. "We can't go on," he finally said. And I felt something inside me break completely. This is destroying both of us. And I don't want us to reach the point of no return. We sat in silence, watching as the evening slowly darkened outside the window. I wanted to say that everything could be fixed, that we could start over. But deep down, I knew it was just an illusion. I had lost too much. And I wasn't sure I could find myself again. Oliver was right. We had no future. And all we could do was try to save at least the remnants of our lives. We parted without unnecessary words. His farewell look was the same as it had been that first evening on the terrace, when everything had just begun. Full of the unknown and the dangerous. I watched him walk away, knowing that this was truly the end. I would never see him again. But the memory of what we had would stay with me forever. Returning home, I realized that my world had become unrecognizable. I stood in the empty living room, listening to the wind rustling outside. And for the first time in a long time, I cried. I couldn't change the past. But now I had to learn to live with its consequences. Ahead lay uncertainty. But deep inside I felt a faint hope that I could start anew. Even if it was from scratch.